Hello and welcome to another tutorial video from CBIS Visual Technology. In this video we will talk about thinkingParticles 7.1 and the new feature we've added with our MPM solver. We are going to create the jelly effect we've just seen in the beginning of this video, and I will do this video from scratch. It's an unscripted video, so please excuse if I run into some issues. The first thing I'm going to do here is just create a box. That's our floor. So we want to have our floor where things can fall down and bounce off. Then the next thing I want to do is our jelly cube. So we want to have cubes falling down in a continuous manner. So let me just move that here and get some scaling a little bit right. So we need some time so that it can accelerate when it falls down. So we will adjust the gravity later on. So pretty simple setup. So we have the floor and we have our object, our jelly cube we want to simulate. The next thing is we create thinkingParticles. We go to the Particles section in 3D Studio Max and click our helper anywhere we want. So we've done that. Let me bring up the user interface of thinkingParticles now. And what we do is first we create our particle group so that we have some order and organization in here. So first we would need our jelly cube. So a group where we store the meshes we want to deform. So I'll just name that particle group cubes jelly. So there we will store the meshes, and then the next group would be our MPM particles that we use to simulate the material point method, the rubbery or jelly simulation itself. So these particles will go into the MPM solver. The next thing we need to do is create a data channel for the particles, and let me create a cluster ID data channel, because what I want to achieve is every cube we create is its own cluster. That will help us in the simulation to differentiate between different cubes, because we want to keep them together and not melt into each other. We could have do this as well, but for the sake of this tutorial we are not going to do that. So I created this in the all group, and that means all subgroups will automatically have this data channel as well. It's kind of a lazy method, because I don't know if I would need it in every group, so I just created it in all. Next thing is my dynamic sets. I'll create 3 dynamic sets and I'll properly name them. So usually I have a create dynamic set where I bring in objects into thinkingParticles. I have my force dynamic set, which is where I add gravity or create any kind of force to my particles. And the last dynamic set is my simulation dynamic sets. So I think with 3 dynamic sets we are pretty good. We have everything. Let's start with the create dynamic set. So I want to bring in objects into thinkingParticles so that we can work with them and start manipulating them. The first thing would be I want to have a object, the cube. So as I said, we want to drop multiple cubes over time, a continuous drop of cubes. So to do that, I will create particles and then assign to this particle the shape. So that's what we are going to do now, and I'll use just the position born. So I press the tab key, that brings the search function, and I'll type in pos, and here we go, we have the position born operator. I'll choose the correct particle group where we want to store the shapes in, and that's the cubes jelly. And I want to create 1 particle per activation. And the next thing I need to make sure is that they don't die on us, these particles, these little suckers, and we'll also give it a little bit more frames to simulate. And let me set the speed to 0 because I want gravity to drag them down. They should not start with an initial speed or so. We could adjust size and all the other parameters, but we don't care because we actually just want to have the original mesh there. So now we have our position born, and the next thing we want to do is think about where's my position, where do we want to born these particles. Also, we want to make sure that, reminds me, we want to deform our cube. So we give it some subdivisions so that we have vertices we can actually deform. Because remember, we want to simulate jelly, and that is deformable surfaces. And we need to have some vertices that we can actually move around and wobble around. Okay, so the next thing, as I said, we want to have multiple particles born over time. So the first thing I'm going to do is a time interval. The time interval just is an on and off switch at a certain frame. So it's a very easy, simple, lazy way to control when things start. Let me start at frame 1. I want to just kick it off my cycle of creating particles at frame 1. And I'll kick that off with an egg timer that is on a loop. So I'll just connect the start input from our time interval. So that means now at frame 1, when the signal comes, we will have 30 frames. And then the reach, when 30 frames are over, it will turn on our position born and create a particle. So now we would need to make sure that maybe 30 is too much. Let's do 20. And we need to make sure it is looping. So once we kick off the egg timer, it should loop every 20 frames. Every 20 frames, it should spit out something. But the issue is, as I said, we start at frame 1, so we have a signal, it's frame 1, but then we would have to wait 20 frames to see our first cube. I don't want that. I want at frame 1 cube born. So I'll grab this logical OR operator and connect it to our position born. So what's happening now is at frame 1 we get a signal. So we start the egg timer, and the egg timer needs 20 frames, so nothing happens there. But the logical OR will pass through the frame 1 on signal to our position born and create right at frame 1 the first cube that's falling down. And 20 frames later we will get the other signal and it will start looping. So that is the little setup we have here to create continuously within a time frame particles with a position born. So pretty simple but powerful setup. You can use it for many things when you want to create a time-based effect or creation of particles. The next thing I want to do is I want to store or remember which particle number each cube has. So there's several ways to do it, but I'm using the counter right now. So the counter is also a pretty simple and straightforward thing, because I can define now exactly from where I want to start counting and up to. So right now I want to start at 1, because that's important for our clusters. We don't want to start at 0, because a 0 cluster means it's no cluster. So I'll start counting at 1 and up to whatever amount of cubes I want to create. So now we have this counter going that would count 1, 2, 3, 4 for whatever every 20 frames. And then I want to set in our data channel, that is in the cubes jelly, that's our mesh of the little jelly cube. I want to count or store the counter in that data channel for every particle we created. So the first cube will have 1, the second will have 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So now we know when we create a cube, we know its cluster ID or the number of the particle we have assigned to it. So That will give us access later and find out, hey, you're cube 1, you're cube 2, you're cube 3. Now we want to assign the shape, and that means we are going to use our geom instance. And geom instance lets us pick any 3D Studio Max mesh. Here we have the cube picked. We take the original size of the mesh as it was defined, and that's practically it. We don't need to set up anything else. So what's happening now is with every egg timer flag, we create a particle with the shape, and we will store the number along with it. The last thing we want to do is, where do we want to create these particles? And I'll pick the node itself. So now we can move around this cube, put it higher, lower, whatever we want. So we feed in the position where we want to born the particles. So that's the first setup we need. And maybe we want to test this setup. That might be a good idea. So if I were to play that right now, we wouldn't see anything because all cubes are at the same position. Okay, so let's just for debugging purpose change the speed, or give the cubes a speed, and there we go. It's working. We are creating every 20 frames a new cube, and they are flying in all directions. So that's working. So we have this nice setup here. Let me just explain again. Time interval starts at frame 1. The logical OR will get through the first cube is created at frame 1. Activate the position born. It will geom instance, and we store the cluster ID, the number of the particle. That's all. So we count up. First cube 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's our counting loop. Then after 20 frames, the egg timer will loop through and create every 20 frames a new cube at the position of the node helper. So now let me just see how can we now deform this cube, because we want to make it jelly, soft and rubbery. So to do that, we will bring in our new node, operator node we have introduced in thinkingParticles 7.1, and that's SimpleDeform. The name Simple is on purpose. It's a very efficient and easy node that allows you to deform any mesh you have inside of thinkingParticles. So you just feed in, tell it, okay, here's my particle group with the meshes. So right now, all the meshes are created in the cube's jelly group. So there's the meshes we want to deform. The next thing we say is, okay, where should be the particles go that control the deformation? And we want to have them in the MPM group, because our MPM, material point method solver, will control these particles. So what we did here is every vertex of the cube, this is why I had to add this subdivision, every vertex will become automatically a particle. So we have now several particles at every vertex position. And the next thing is we could have surface particles, but for the tutorial we don't need that. The next thing I'll grab is the volume particles. So I want to fill the cube with particles, and I'll use a raster of 2 centimeters. So every 2 centimeters inside of this cube, we will have another particle, the volume particles. And they also are stored in the MPM particle group, because we want everything to be in one particle group so that our MPM, material point solver, can handle all these materials in one go. So the next thing we want to just check and see if we get the particles. So I'll see we have the particles, and let me just hide the original object as well. We no longer need that. So the mesh, the original mesh object, I'll just hide it from the viewport. And As we can see, at frame 0 nothing happens because our time interval is not active, and now at frame 1 it's active. And we can nicely see we have our vertex particles and we have our volume particles. So now we have a cube filled with particles, and every vertex on the surface is also creating a particle. So right now nothing happens when we play back because there's no force or anything affecting these particles. That brings me to the next step, the force. Let's add some gravity and see how it goes. So I'll type in force, and we only want the force on the MPM particles because the MPM is dragging along, deforming these particles. Wherever these particles go, our mesh will go, and the SimpleDeform will take care of that. It will automatically search or match the particles to its closest neighbor to deform this object. Let me just move that out of the way and see if our gravity is working. And we can already see the gravity is working. The cubes, every 20 frames we have a new cube dropping down on the floor. So now we need to do a little bit more planning. So we have the gravity working. Now we might want to start with our simulation setup. So what we want to do is we want to collide with the floor and we want to simulate a material property. So for that, the first thing, we create our flow solver. And it's important that our flow solver gets at least 2 subsamples, because when we do MPM effects, we need some subsamples to distribute forces within the volume of an object. Next thing is we want to have collisions with the floor. So I'll just grab a flow boundary and I pick the flow solver and we add our boundary or collision object. I'll just click on the floor and that's actually it. We don't need to do anything else here. This object will automatically be our floor object for collisions. The last thing missing is our flow MPM node. And the flow MPM node is the actual core node that holds all the settings and parameters for our simulation. So we will pick the flow MPM, and now we have all the nodes set up. We need to make sure that in the flow MPM we tell it to use the flow solver we have here. We could have multiple flow solvers, for example. That's why we just specify the flow. And most importantly, where is our MPM particle group, or where are the particles we want to use to simulate our jelly? Jelly is one of the hyperelastic material properties we've introduced in thinkingParticles 7.1. Before we go deeper into adjusting the Jelly MPM solver, let's have a look at our setup we have here. So in the dynamic set, it looks all fine. Flow MPM, flow boundary, and the flow solver at the end. However, this is my intended order of processing because the flow solver must always be the last one in the queue. But when we have a look at the tree view, and this is the hierarchy view, that tells me our flow solver is first in the list, which doesn't make sense. So I have to move it down to the end of the list. And the flow MPM I'll move up, and the flow boundary I move in between. So now the order is correct and how it should be. So keep that in mind. The order in the hierarchy defines the order of processing, and with simulations or physics simulations, it's very important if you have a boundary happening before or after the solver reacts or does something. Okay, let's continue adjusting the jelly setup. Let's put the cell size to 2 centimeters because we have a smaller cube, and I want the acceleration limit around 1000 so that we can have nice force propagation inside of the MPM volume. Boundary friction I'll set to 0.2. Next on the list is our viewport display. We go to the show group and we select the cluster display option. That will show us the clusters in different colors. That's very good for debugging purpose. And talking about clusters, we need to activate them or we won't see any clusters at all. We want to simulate hyperelastic material, so I'll dial down the stiffness to a very low value. And I'll adjust the boundary friction for the clusters here and the cluster friction as well. Last thing on the list is our data channel. Our data channel 0. Remember, we created a data channel in the all group. That's our channel 0 with the cluster ID, where we store the cluster ID for each cube so that we know all the particles that are created belong to this cube. This is a very important step because we want to treat every cube as an individual in the MPM simulation. We don't want them to melt together MPM wise. So this is why we're using clusters. There's one last thing we need to resolve. We need to tell the system which particle belongs to which cube. So we create these MPM particles, the vertex particles, the volume particles, and we need to transfer the cluster ID from our original cube to the individual particles so that we know this particle was created when this cube was created. So we do that with the particle data, where we can transfer data channels. So we are going to use the particle data helper, and we are assigning the group. So we are grabbing the cube's jelly, that's our original mesh particle. And now we need to access the cube that was created. So we know in SimpleDeform we have the output of the deformed particle. So we know this particle 1, for example, of this jelly cube is now active and creates particles. So now we know, okay, when this particle 1 is there, I want to transfer to all particles that are created, I want to transfer the cluster ID. We can easily achieve this by using another particle data. And now we are using the particle data operator to transfer the information from one data channel to another. So I'll feed in the created particles, the vertex-born particles from the SimpleDeform, and we want to store the information in the MPM group. So the particles that are created for cube 1 are now transferred. The particle cluster ID we created in the step before are now transferred over to the MPM particles. So now we know all these particles belong to cube 1. So regardless how many vertex-born particles we create, if we change the mesh geometry or anything, we always know this particle that was born belongs to cube 1. Now we need to do that for our volume particles as well. Also, the volume particles all land in the big particle soup of MPM group. So all the particles land there. So we need to identify, hey, this particle belongs to cube 1, so that our MPM solver can treat these cubes as individuals. Instead, if we wouldn't do that, it would treat all the particle cloud as one big continuum mechanics object, and we don't want that. So let me just add for the purpose of being complete, the surface-borne particles as well. So this is how you would do it. Every particle created by SimpleDeform is assigned to a cube we create up there with the cluster ID. So now that we have done this, we are hopefully ready to play and test out our setup and see if it works. And first thing we see, it explodes. So drama, we have drama here. It's exploding, we don't want that. And explosion is a good indication that our forces are too high or our subsamples are too low, because we are dealing with a lot of forces inside of our MPM object. Oh, there's one more adjustment I need to do is the viewport display. Right now it's set to real time. We can't have that with the simulation software. We cannot skip frames because we have to simulate each frame because the frames are dependent on each other. So did that. Now we can see and follow how this works. And let's have a look how our hyperelastic object looks like. And we can see it's working. Another issue shows up. We see white particles, and white means that these particles are not belonging to any cluster. So we cannot have that. We need to make sure that these particles are not leaving their cluster. So we need to do some minor tweaks in our MPM solver. And we are going to, let me just move that over here. We are going to adjust some settings here in the MPM solver. Remember, we want to keep all the particles in their respective cluster. They should not leave the cluster. So we don't want to create any separate clusters. We need to make sure of that. And probably our forces are still way too high. That will create extreme forces inside of our hyperelastic object. So I'll just reduce for a test the forces we have and have a test run here and see how it goes now. And we'll have it play back here, and there we go. Oh, they are very squishy. Okay. So, but we can see now they stay in their cluster. We have every new cube has a new color. So we have achieved what we wanted, but our stiffness is way too low, our force. So let me put that back to 10,000 and see how it goes. And there we go. Yeah, nice. That's what we wanted. Nice squishy jelly cubes. And we can see it's working beautiful. So 10,000 was the sweet spot for this type of simulation. And what we might want to do next is show maybe the meshes. And we'll go back and activate in our master dynamic set show mesh, and we'll turn off the MPM particles because these are practically just our helper particles to deform the surface. And now we can see our original mesh dropping down, deforming. So every one of these particles is taking a vertex of the original mesh and it's deforming it. And we can see it's doing this really nice. And keep in mind, this is a tutorial, so we are not heading here for Hollywood high-end quality. We can always dial in the parameters much higher and stronger. But for now, that looks really good. Let me just adjust a little bit the cell size because I can see some extreme deformations. And that's usually an indicator that particles penetrate each other, so we want to make sure that doesn't happen. And now it's even better. I love it. Look at these nice hyperelastic deformations. So that's a good setup. The cell size is fine. Let me just discuss and explain a new parameter we have here, and that's our cluster push force. That was also introduced in thinkingParticles 7.1, and that's an extra force we have here where a cluster can push another cluster out of its way. So if there is a penetration or intersection happening, there's a force applied to push it out of the cluster. And that's what's happening now. So I think now we have a really nice setup and natural looking effect we can see here. We are nearing the end of this tutorial. I hope you enjoyed this tutorial and have fun reproducing the effect. But before we close, let me adjust one more setting, and that's the cluster stiffness. You remember we have these stiffness values, these various stiffness values. We have one in the MPM solver. So we have the stiffness down here. Let me just move down here. So in the Jelly solver we have the stiffness, but we also have the stiffness in the cluster. And the cluster stiffness is different. It's added on top of what the MPM solver does. So the MPM is still hyperelastic, but with stiffness I can dial in or dial out the MPM effect, however you want to look at it. The cubes are less squishy. Thank you for watching this video and check out our other videos as well. Goodbye.